So we've heard both Professor Foster and Professor Wan talk theorizing the experiences of revolution, and also discussing concepts about the weakest link. And we will, so as I propose that we first listen to the four discussants, and then we could have the interactive debates. So now I would like to invite Professor Boaventura de Sousa Santos from the University of Coimbra in Portugal. We are very honored to have you with us tonight. And Professor Boaventura de Sousa Santos is professor at the School of Economics, and he is also distinguished legal scholar at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Law School, global legal scholar at the University of Warwick, and also director of the Center for Social Studies at the University of Coimbra. So, Professor de Sousa Santos, please.
Good afternoon, good morning to John Bellamy, to good night to other people. And I'm so happy to see some of my very dear and old friends like Issa SHIVJI. It's a great pleasure to be here. And well, in the 15 minutes I have, I think that we should really start from concrete analysis of concrete times. And I think the pandemic for me has been very transparent. It looks like that for me, the centuries never start with the first year of the century. Generally, they usually start with some crisis or some great event that inscribes the century. I think that the 19th century probably started with the Industrial Revolution of 1830s, and I think the 20th century started with the First World War and with the Russian Revolution. Well, I think that in the second case, all these big transformations, they had very good theories behind them. I think that the first one, but the liberal theory was at the climax at the time, when in fact Marx was already being prepared to have his own theory. And I think the 20th century was very much marked by Marxism. All of us, well, I speak for myself, we had Marxist training, and therefore we are very much aware of the wealth and richness of this theory. But my problem is this: I mean, all these centuries, they have their own theories. What is our theory? Because if the 21st century is beginning now, well, there is no Marx around. So what would Marx and Lenin think about our time today? Well, at the time of Marx and even Lenin, most of the world were colonies, were European colonies, or on unknown worlds. Now, most of the dynamics of capitalism comes from the south, not from the north, and many realities are new. I mean, we have to understand that if there is a new situation, which are the new theories? So our theories are not enough in my conception. So we need to re-theorize society. And I think that we need new theories. In fact, we need an epistemic revolution first. I think we are still too much dependent on Western-centric knowledge. And the experience of Africa, of Latin America, of Asia is so profound and deep that we should move to a non-Eurocentric type of ways of thinking. And other authors should be claiming our presence and so on. So I think that it is in that sense that I think that we have to unlearn many of the theories that we learned in the past and to try to learn other theories and other understandings to capture our time. And it is in that way that I'll follow with some notes, because these are really notes in a sense that we cannot really cover all the reality today. And I think the pandemic is clear about that. For instance, we have always been used about concepts of development, north-south hierarchies. What is the crisis telling us? Is the new failed state of the world is the United States. The United States is a failed state. We know how the conception was created. It was developed to stigmatize the countries in the South. And then was the failed states. And then there was the fragile states. Look at the United States. The United States is a failed state. So What are you going to theorize all these changes? There are many countries in Africa that in protecting the lives of their people, or in Asia, much better than Italy or France or the United States or United Kingdom. The world is changing. So should we not change our theories? Well, a few notes on this. The first one is that I think that I think if Marx were here with us, you would definitely, looking at George Floyd lynching and all these things, you would really come to the conclusion that is very clear for us for some time, is that we don't live in capitalist societies. We live in capitalist, colonialist, and patriarchal societies. These are the three main forms of domination. Colonialism does not exist without colonialism. Capitalism does not exist without colonialism, that is to say, without racism and without patriarchy. Why? Because free labor does not sustain itself with highly developed labor and non-paid labor. Who are the people that produce highly developed labor and non-paid labor? Racialized bodies and sexualized bodies. So capitalism does not exist without colonialism and patriarchy. What is the drama of our time is that, in fact, we see that the domination is articulated. When capitalism becomes really stronger and more savage, racism increases. Patriarchy, feminicide increases. That is to say, the three dominations are articulated. And we in social movements, in our politics, we still distinguish and fragmented. Some movements have been anti-capitalist, but they have been racist and they have been sexist. Other movements have been anti-colonialist, but they have been pro-capitalist and they have sexist. And many feminist movements are really feminist, but they are racist, some of them, and they are not anti-capitalist, some of them. So I think that the drama is that domination is articulated and resistance is fragmented. And we should unite more the struggles, and not just the left, but the social movements. Some of you know that I've been very much active in the World Social Forum from the very beginning, and we are in fact at this point trying to renew, reconstruct, refound, reorganize the World Social Forum to account for the situation in our time. So if you take these notions, then we should see that probably what we need is that this epistemic transformation forces us to bring new actors, new political subjects. I mean, it's the working class, of course, but who are the working class? The most important struggle and strike in Brazil in recent months is the strike of the Uberized workers, the people that deliver in takeaway, catering, and delivery of food at home. These people have no rights. They don't even can pee in the restaurants in which they are, delivering the food. They are not even authorized into it. They are slavery, the new slavery labor. So this is the situation in which we are. So I think that we should really move to bring on more political subjects and women. If you look, for instance, at Chile, who is conducting the struggles in Chile, they're the feminist women, the women that managed to articulate the anti-capitalist movement with the feminist movement and the intercultural movement. That is to say, with the Indian people, indigenous people in Chile. So asking and struggling, they are now struggling on the streets. And what is the slogan? I prefer to be dead by the COVID-19 than to be dead as hungry by hunger. That is to say, this is the desperate that neoliberalism is conducting these people. So I think that what we need is to engage new theories, new people, new knowledges, what I call the epistemologies of the South, knowledges born in struggle. We don't see here the social movements, the ones that are conducting the struggle. And I think that here on that, they rarely use the word socialism. They never use the word communism. This is a word used by, of course, by Zizek, by BADIOU, various scholars that I know very well and I'm a friend of. But this is not enough anymore. Because when I work with indigenous people, what they tell me is that socialism was a white man's trap, because socialism was for a long time racist. So I think that we have to understand reality from the bottom up. And in order to understand it from the bottom up, we have to engage with this diversity of the world, as Professor Wang was saying, and we have to engage in theories and conducts and practices of transition. We don't achieve a new society from one day to the next. We don't have transition theories. We have a very good transition theory from feudalism to capitalism, and Marx did it. But we don't have other transition theories. How we go from here to there, how we are going to change our consumption habits, how we are going to change our economy based on oil and gas, how we are going to change the energy metrics of our time, how are we going to change our education so that people are taught not to be individualists, entrepreneurs as they call them. Well, they are really self-slaved, enslaved people. That's our reality today. So I think that we need to start from anti-capitalist, anti-colonialist, and anti-patriarchal struggles bit by bit and trying to accumulate them. For instance, the universal income is basic at this point. It's being launched. We should struggle for very concrete struggles at this point. I think this is one of the struggles that we should, the solidarity tax reform. I mean, we have such poor tax reforms in the world today. I think we should fight for food sovereignty. The pandemic is telling us that we need food sovereignty. Via Campesina, the peasants around the world have been saying that all the time. All of a sudden, we know that the global production chain failed completely whenever there is a pandemic. The most developed country in the world cannot produce masks or gloves. I mean, what is this? What kind of protection of people are these states allowing at this point? Neoliberalism has incapacitated, and capitalism in this savage form has incapacitated the states from protecting. So the states are becoming more and more repressive. And I think that if no alternative comes in immediately, this even what we call democracy, which is really a farce in most cases, I think will collapse completely. We see the laboratory is being constructed in Brazil. When we see the possibility of a coup is already there by a free elected president. So I think that we should start by that. I think that we should re-energize the World Social Forum. There is a struggle that we have inside the Social Forum to see whether we can go from an open space to a space of action, in which a plurality of political subjects, global, local, and national struggles, subjects, integrating different struggles when we can meet. Because I think that what surprises me as a theorist and an activist is that at this present time, the young people with whom I work also, for instance, rappers, hip-hop culture, women, it is easier for the young people to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. What kind of the world is this? I mean, Greta Thunberg, she imagines the end of the world, but she does not imagine the end of capitalism. This is the failure of our education. This is the failure of critical thinking. And I think we need really to start again in many respects, always in continuity. There is no break with Marxism. We have to reconstruct. We have to be Marxists. We have to be Paulo Freire, educationists, but in our time, conducting our own struggles. And here I have, and I end with this, that in fact we don't start immediately with a transition period with concrete analysis, which will be very different in Latin America, in Europe, in Asia, and in Africa. But they converge to a kind of an anti-capitalist, anti-colonialist, and anti-patriarchal orientation. If you do that, then you can probably succeed. Otherwise, I have seen so many times that we have announced the end of capitalism. Wallerstein, before Samir, in fact, I was a very good friend of Samir. We met very often, not only in Dakar, at the Côte d'Azur, but also in the World Social Forum. But, this accumulation of crises, well, we have been saying that all the time. And capitalism survives all the time. So we have to send and produce other ways of renewing our theories. So that would be my message. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. So now we are heating up with. So I first well, let me introduce Professor Isabel MONAL, and we are actually very happy to be able to have her with us, because we have to get over many of the sanctions of the U.S. on Cuba, and so so we are very happy that we could be connected. So Professor MONAL is has been the director of the National Theatre of Cuba during the times when there was the, I think I remember that she was being recruited by Che Guevara himself. She is a full academic and professor of merit at the University of Havana and professor of merit of the Superior Institute of International Relations of Cuba. And she is considered one of the greatest intellectuals of the revolutionary period. So, Isabel, please.
Well, good morning and good afternoon and all the hours of the day. First of all, I want to express my thanks for being invited to this forum and having the opportunity also to see and say meet all friends and colleagues with whom I had not been in touch personally for already several years now. So I'm very happy of that too. I will sort of choose some of the issues that have been put on the table. So I will rather refer to 3 points. Global crisis certainly implies many dimensions. Today we become more and more aware that the fate of the existence of our species, that is the Homo sapiens, is in danger. Up to a certain extent, global decisions and measures can be taken to change the status of the situation. I do not deny that we can meet people from different view, different system, and make common efforts to have a fight and to take measures against what is going on with the destruction of the planet and ecological crisis and so forth. But that is limited, that is restrained. But the changes that should be implemented are such that it would be an extreme naive belief that this situation can be reverted towards a positive trend within capitalism. Even if it would be a sort of kind of less worse capitalism that many colleagues from the other night thought of existing. So for me, even this mild, so-called mild form of capitalism is even enough barbarism and against human beings and society and the planet as such. So in my understanding, the necessary emphasis in an appropriate ecological perspective is only possible within as a part of a new society, the socialist society. I am completely aware this socialist society has nothing to do, of course, when I speak with social democracy, but of course I am aware that according to Marx, is socialism, which of course in Cuba we do not say that we are having it already. That's what reality makes us to learn, that a period for construction of socialism in a country so limited resources, so a country that is facing such an enormous aggressivity of the greater imperialism, imperium, and domination that the world has known, is a situation that could not be foreseen by Marx, not even by Lenin. So we have no other choice than to create solutions. And sometimes we fail, sometimes we do not fail. But our greatest success is that we are still here after more than 60 years. So think as a whole, with all this aggression, how is it possible that we still are? And this is our greatest achievement. So communism is still foreseen, in my point of view, not as Marx thought that would be a shorter period, it will take longer. So that's learning, that's developing Marxism. New ideas, but new ideas develop taking into account the revolutionary experiences and still within the trend developed and created by Marx, Engels, Lenin, Gramsci, Fidel Castro, and many others. And that is the point, to be creative within Marxism. Gramsci said, and I think he was right, that the solutions of the problems that Marxism could have in interpretation, we can find it within Marxism. So, like other science, do not go away to others, but within themselves find new solutions in being scientific, rational, and creative at the same time. So, a free class struggle for a new society, that is the socialist society, is absolutely necessary. The world should get rid of capitalism and imperialism. This is essential. If we forget that we are in a world dominated in a whole by certain countries, and the greatest of all, which is the United States of America, and that is imperialism. That's what we are facing. They look forward always for domination. And following Gramsci again, I distinguish domination from hegemony. So it's not imperialist hegemony, but it's imperialism, domination, according to my view. Of course, I think that concerning, for example, culture, imperialism would use more the ways of hegemony than the ways of domination. But in general, they struggle and try to implement a domination. Within the enormous imperialist oppression, a possible solution for ecological and ambientalist problems just cannot be found. So as simple as that. It would be an enormous mistake if we lower the importance and determinant role of class struggle. A sustainable society requires also, as a whole, that this society be a society of social justice. So efforts and endeavors for ecology and sustainability should be articulated, linked, united with other forms of struggle like class struggle and the struggle against imperialism, that is anti-imperialism, as well as other forms of struggle and effort against all forms of exploitation, inequality, and exploitation. That comes there, then comes there the struggle of the women for the equality and against inequity. And this we find this line of struggle since the beginning of Marxism. And we had very special moment like the moment of Rosa Luxemburgo, which is illuminating also the way in which this struggle can be developed on the basis of Marxist interpretation of the development of society and history as such. So a new socioeconomic formation seeking an integrated emancipation is the adequate process for appropriate and necessary ecological development and care. I think that today facts confirm Rosa Luxemburgo words, socialism or barbarism. I would like now, as a second point, to refer, it has been mentioned in a previous session of our forum, this Gramsci reflection about the new and the old, which I think we have hints there and profound and interesting thinking that we should develop more today according to the new situation and the learning and experiences that we had throughout the 20th century, the good and the bad experiences, the success and the mistakes. As we know, Gramsci made an incisive and profound reflection on the concept of the new and the old in the relation with historic process. I think that to recall that some of this reflection is useful and appropriate for our analysis and condition for subjects and themes of today's crises and worries. I will not enter in various disagreement with part of the social thesis and uses of thesis metaphors, lacks of correct perception of the general world evolution and failure to understand the place and connection of very important ambientalist themes in the real strong connection with historical evolution. On the contrary, I want to stress the links that unite us and put us together. One thing seems to me very clear, that the ecological and ambientalist problems cannot be solved within the capitalist system today. By no means I ignore that socialism in its experiences, historical, have made also mistakes. I'm not saying that capitalism is not in the nature of socialism. So I don't ignore the mistake, damages, and lack of interest in previous experiences of socialism carried out in Eastern Europe and Soviet Union. But the process of socialism appears in today's world as the sole system capable of establishing a real, sustainable socio-economic system, which does not mean that the overcoming of class, of exploitation of classes and other forms of inequalities is still the essential point of our struggle and our creative action in doing it. These endeavors as a whole, putting together all these different forms of struggle, this constitute, according to my way of seeing things, that the new, and then I get into Gramsci's wording and concept completely, which the new will still do not arrive or succeed in becoming a reality. And at the same time, the past, the old, through a variety of forms, there are various forms or still being in the past. It's not only one. This is very important. It still constitutes the social reality of today. So the new still do not become a reality, and the past is still there. And it is convenient to recall some of Gramsci's wording. This is, I think, very important. He underlines an essential phenomenon. The old dies, muore in Italiano, muore. The old dies and the new cannot be born, or is not born yet. So here we have both at the same time. We have to explore this. We have to use this way of approaching for our analysis of the ecological problem and capitalism and socialism. So Gramsci also talks, and I please pay also always attention to the wording. He underlines dies and cannot be born. He talks about struggle between them both, struggle between the past and the old and the new. There is a struggle. Talk also of the tra il vecchio e il nuovo, within the old and the new. He identifies a possible interregno, that's in between two, in a sort of a kind of a transition. So in this interregno, in which the vecchio, that is the old, muore, dies, il nuovo non può nascere, and the new cannot be born. He speaks of a conflict which is historical recurrent, means this struggle, this situation is not completely new in the history of mankind. You can find it in history in other period of transition from the old and from the old to the new. This is, I think, very important. He's talking not only for the present time, which was his present time, but also in general. Also, la lotta, this is also very important to my point of view. Old and the new in the field, between the old thinking and the new thinking. And for Gramsci, the new thinking is Marxism. So still today, it's Marxism in its development, overcoming things that had been wrong on theory. He also speaks of the lotta tra el pesato e il nuovo pensiero, the struggle between the old thinking and the new thinking. And I underline this now. He talks about war motive no. He speaks about the like something that is like a will, the will. Yeah, volontà, vuole. Like the will of the new and the will of the old. The old wants to, will to, wishes to stay, and the nuovo, the new wishes. So we have wishes, we have struggle, we have process. Look at the variety that wants to live. This is an important wording. And he also speaks of spreading, yes, diffundendo. So it becomes popular. diventato popolare. This is very important. So it has to go throughout, to be spread all over the people, to become popular, which is the creation of consciousness, of course, of the new conception of the world. The hand, in all senses, that we in Latin America we have to process at the same time, and it's a process of substitution from one thing to the other. So at the end, the new should become dominant, be implanted as reality, and therefore there is a process of substitution of the old, the vecchio, and the contribution, and there can be exist. This is incredible. They can both exist at the same time. There can be combination. We are facing that, I think. We are facing that, for example, in many countries in Latin America, that many colleagues, even in the left, sort of want a kind of combination of the old and new. Of course, something of the old in the sense of Hegel and Marx, yes, of heaven will always stay. But what he's talking here is combination of them both. And this is a complex process. So I think we have there a field of reflection. I would like to refer very briefly to a third thing. Before I finish, I would like to make some reference to the present epidemic affecting the whole world today. And this reference concerns some of the idea and thinking we have reached me lately. I'm worried about this thinking. Of course, the impact of such epidemic is of great importance. Many capitalist countries that had damaged or even almost destroyed in a great deal or almost completely their health system and institutions have, as we have all been aware and seen, rich shocking statistics and contamination and death. The epidemic has shown to the people and still shows that neoliberal capitalism offers what neoliberal capitalism offers, and the masses, I think, are becoming more and more aware and understanding the meaning of this situation. But several colleagues have been, from my point of view, too optimistic about the possible result of this epidemic, particularly in the left. They foreseen as a result of this epidemic the becoming of a new world, even a sort of proto-socialism in the very near future, as a result not of the economic situation, of course, partially, but of the epidemic as such. Personally, I think this kind of analysis and interpretation seems to lead to wrong tactics and strategies for progressive or revolutionary movement. Personally, this kind of excessive expectations on the epidemic rather creates in many of us many worries, without denying the impact of the epidemic in creating a consciousness, and therefore so working in that direction, creating it is essential to keep in mind that radical changes in society, as foreseen by a group of colleagues, can only find its fundament and can also be created by real socio-economic and political process. It would be very wrong to be optimistic, as as for the result of the epidemic that will bring us or lead us, at least in Latin America and some of our friends think, to a proto-socialism and a social amending.
Yes, well, thank you.
Thank
Yes,
you very
thank
much.
you. Thank you, Isabel. So, well, we will come back to the interactive session later. So now I would like to invite Professor Issa SHIVJI from the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. He's director of the Nehru Resource Center of the Tanzania Commission for Science and Technology. He's also a Tanzanian author and academic, and one of Africa's leading experts on law and development issues. So, Issa, please.
Thank you very much, Kinchu. My really sincere gratitude to Kinchu for inviting me to this very interesting session, and I've learned a lot and met some old friends. And I think it is a continuation of a conversation, but important break in the conversation with this pandemic that we are facing. I would only like to make a few comments. I will not take my full 15 minutes. I would like to basically my 4 comments. One is what Professor Foster, I think, raised a very important point, or how in the Marxist tradition at some point economy and ecology was separated and was not integrated in our analysis and in our understanding and in our politics. I think that is extremely important. Secondly, the question of stagist notion of change, and particularly revolutionary change. I would like to say a few things on that. The third one, Professor Wang's very interesting extension of the concept of equality, the five dimensions of the concept of equality. And finally, I would like to say a few things on my friend Santos' suggestion that we need to make an epistemic break, and particularly how do we address the question of new political subjects. First of all, the question of economics and ecology and the separation between the two. I would like to suggest that while it is true that sometimes a kind of vulgarized form of Marxism, these were separated, but I think inherent, or rather potentially, in the concept of Marx, we already have a possibility, we already have a connection between ecology and economics. And I would say the link is in the concept of primitive accumulation. Although very often it has been said, and to such an extent, I think Marx probably also contributed to this, primitive accumulation as the original form of accumulation. And then, of course, it goes on to the analysis of the expanded reproduction. I would argue that, in fact, during the whole existence of capitalist system, primitive accumulation has never left the process. It is a part of the process. And not only the old form of primitive accumulation of land arbitrage, labor arbitrage, and so on, unpaid labor, etc., but even new forms of primitive accumulation. And under neoliberalism, we saw some of these new forms of primitive accumulation, like, for example, the privatization of public goods, health, water, education, other public services, and so on. But the pillage of ecology, which has been there from the beginning of capitalism, is, in my view, I would like to suggest, a form of primitive accumulation. Because here capital is making use of free contribution to its accumulation without it being costed or accounted for. Even in Marx's formula of expanded reproduction, ecology is not costed. And yet we have seen, and now we are seeing, the most horrendous results of the pillage and destruction of ecology and environment in the form of pandemics and so on and so forth. So I would argue that, in fact, in the concept of primitive accumulation, I would like to suggest that in the concept of primitive accumulation, we can already see a link between economics and ecology. The second point that I would like to make on the question of stagism, I agree that this is another area where, although I think Professor Foster was a bit generous to say that understandable during those times of socialist debates to talk in terms of stage, probably even during those times, probably it was not totally understandable. I think this has had a negative effect on Marxism and development Marxism, the stagist approach. And in Stalin's times, it became really fossilized, the stagist approach. In the third world, in Africa, the stagist approach was in terms of nationalist struggle, and then you talk about socialist emancipation. But we have, for example, and I often quote Amilcar Cabral, that Amilcar Cabral made a very profound, interesting statement when he said that with independence in African countries, independence is only a stage where national liberation movement is in power. And he argued that so long as imperialism exists, the national liberation struggle does not cease. There you find continuity between stages already. Pregnant in that observation, in that profound statement, is a continuity rather than look at the stages process. And I think we need a similar way of looking at socialism and communism. But it seems to me that the germs of communism are born within the socialist period. And rather than see socialism as a stage, we see socialism as a new form or a new stage of struggle, of class struggle. And to a certain extent in Mao, we saw this, that class struggle doesn't cease with socialism. Class struggle continues under socialism. Although I think some of the theoreticians from China these days talk in terms of the end of class struggle in China. So in Mao, when he talked about the continuous form of class struggle, I think he was already trying to address the question of stages from socialism to communism. The third point on equality, I really very much enjoyed Professor Wang's interpretation, extension of the concept of equality. And particularly the last two ones on the question of equality of diversity or diversity equality, and the question of important that in any struggle for equality within the boundaries, there should always be international dimension. Therefore, internationalism should be built into the struggle for equality. I think these two are extremely important. I say these are important because the present stage, we are, even in the progressive movement, we are witnessing certain trends which I think have to be understood and, in my view, combated. For example, the question of diversity. It is a question of diversity which is giving rise to two things. One, either the question of identity politics, in other words, diversity being crystallized in identity politics, as opposed to class politics. And two, diversity taking a cultural form, and it becomes a narrow culturalism, or even narrow nationalism, both of which seems to me lend credence to authoritarian narrow nationalisms and even neo-fascism. And that takes me to the fourth aspect on the question of equality. And this, I think, is very important, that equality only seen in terms of national equality, equality of nations, or equality of sovereign nations, I think has to be transcended. Equality has to be built into the very struggle for equality within the so-called boundaries. Therefore, internationalism should be part of it. Otherwise, it leads us into what we are witnessing all over the world. Narrow nationalism based on race, religion, and various fundamentalisms. The international dimension should be all the time kept and built into our progressive struggles. Finally, let me come to the final point that Boa was making. I totally agree with Professor Santos that we need to re-theorize and develop Marxism, taking into account the new situation, new concrete conditions, and new political subjects. And I would like to suggest, although I think this has to be worked, I've been discussing this for some time now, that the new political subject, although I know that this term has been used before, I would say working people, rather than simply workers or peasants or informal or so-called informal workers and so on and so forth. The concept of working people embraces the new political subjects as well. And this is all over, not simply in the West, but even in many Southeast countries. Because you find, for example, street hawkers, young people in many African cities as street hawkers. They're neither the proletariat nor the peasants. Okay, where do you include them? Or you find women, for example, cooking food and supplying to construction workers. You find that all in various cities of Africa. The question of struggle against racism, struggle against patriarchy, and struggle against capitalism. How do we integrate that? I think that is extremely important. And I think Professor Santos is making an extremely important point. And to very large extent, and myself included, we among Marxists and socialists have not always been conscious of integrating these forms of struggle and building a common concept. But my question to my friend, Professor Santos, would be, in these struggles, where do you bring in class? Where do you bring in class? How do you deal with the question of class? If you bring in the question of struggle against racism, I agree with it. Struggle against patriarchy, I also agree with it. But where do you bring in the dimension of class? And if you do not bring in the question of class, then there are dangers, obviously. There are dangers in these struggles. They do become crystallized either in identity politics or politics which do not easily are amenable to capitalism. I think you also mentioned it. That you can be anti-racist and still not anti-capitalist. Or you can be anti-patriarchy and still not anti-capitalist. So I think this is an important question. So while I agree that we need to integrate this into a new concept and theorize it new, in a new fashion, extending Marxism, the way Fanon tried to extend Marxism, taking into account the new political subjects, but at the same time, we should not throw out of the window the very, in my view, very central concept of class and class struggle in Marxism. Because I think those still remain very important. Kinchi, those are only a few comments that I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now I would like to invite our last discussant, the fourth discussant, Professor Praveen Jha. He's Professor of Economics at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning, and also adjunct professor at the Center for Informal Sector and Labor Studies in the Jawaharlal Nehru University from India. And he's also one of the editors of the journal, Agrarian South, Journal of Political Economy. So over to you, Professor Jha.
Let me first of all express my gratitude to comrades Kinchi and Setsui for including me in this conversation, the panel, but also the forum at large, and it's been a privilege to attend a few other sessions. What we have discussed and are discussing in this particular panel is, of course, of tremendous importance. One can hardly overstate it. And we have had absolutely great inputs from the preceding speakers, all five of them, as has been highlighted very well, that we are talking of a crisis like none before. It is an unprecedented crisis. As Professor Foster put it, it's catastrophe capitalism. It is something which was realized quite some time ago. It's not the case that we have come to this catastrophe capitalism yesterday or day before. Since Samir was mentioned very frequently, Kinchi onward, let me recall what Samir said, that for at least more than half a century, we have been in the throes of what he called a long-drawn crisis, a crisis which does not seem to have any exit route, the way it's functioning, the way it's evolving for a variety of reasons. And with reference to only the economic dimension of it, he kept talking about this persistence for quite some time. But on the other hand, if we are talking of a more comprehensive sense, in a systemic sense, where we are talking about not only the economy, but ecology and other issues which were raised by all the preceding speakers, Samir very frequently talked of a crisis which is really long drawn, really long drawn. And basically he associated that with the system as a whole, capitalism as a system. Repeated plea that it would be a waste of time to get caught into thinking of ending the crisis of capitalism. What is absolutely key, absolutely important, the most important message that he wanted to share repeatedly was to ending and transcending capitalism. So a great deal of crisis which is being talked about, many dimensions of crisis that we discussed, as was highlighted by all the preceding speakers, have a lot to do obviously with the system as a whole, and how do we sort of then think about these in a manner from the point of view of moving forward in terms of what could be the political project. Right? It has been pointed out by very sharply that issues of race, patriarchy, gender, class, as Professor SHIVJI mentioned just now, all these are inextricably enmeshed with every kind and every dimension of contemporary capitalism, which has generated multiple nodes, etc., of what we have been discussing as the crisis. Of course, so are the issues of caste, which is a big thing in, let's say, South Asia and Middle East and some other parts of the world, issues of ethnicity, issues which have to do with diversities of many other kinds, social, political, economic basis of diversity, which again came up in the discussion by Professor Foster, Professor Bangui, and other preceding speakers. So the question that we have to confront is the ways in which all these divisions have been continuously used, abused by the masters of the world. Now, it's not happening today. It's been happening all through, using this sort of the whole spectrum of divide and rule strategies, all through in the history of capitalism, as being absolutely central in perpetuating these divisions to ensure certain kinds of trajectories that we have seen historically. As Professor SHIVJI mentioned, that with respect to, for instance, a whole segments and areas, we have to get back to the idea of the centrality of primitive accumulation in facilitating, ensuring, and carrying forward the agenda of capitalism, a point which, again, Samir used to make very frequently. Professor Samir used to say that historical capitalism and primitive accumulation in that sense are organically connected. I mean, there's just no way that you can sort of take primitive accumulation out of it. And then what does it do to the tribes? What does it do to the caste? What does it do to the races? What does it do to, let's say, countries in the global south and so on and so forth? How do we sort of work out all those mechanisms and strategies and so on and so forth? Right? So, as I said, I mean, I think the conversation today has been extremely useful in terms of recalling and recapping many of these extremely important insights which are absolutely central to our understanding of Marxist political economy. These have been well known, well analyzed, and we have indeed humongous literature, very large literature, and many of our co-panelists have contributed in very significant ways to each one of these areas. We also, I think, have no dearth of blueprints on ways forward. Some of these were brought into sharp relief in today's conversation as well. Right? So how do we try and move in a direction to address these absolutely humongous and central challenges that the humanity confronts? And in that context, whether it's the question of stages, whether it is the question of thinking of a kind of an agenda today, which might then lead on to, in the Leninist framework, the next stage subsequently, etc. Again, all these are very much there. Now, I'm not suggesting that we have any clear consensus on what the way forward can be, but my sense is that there is a great deal. We know enough, again, in terms of what should be the possible, let's say, outlines, blueprints, etc. The real question, and which is what I want to just spend my another 2 minutes on to conclude what I had to say, is how do we go about it? As I said, I mean, there's, no lack of blueprints in terms of that architecture of possible alternatives, right? We know that its central concern, call it socialism, communism, whatever we want to call it, right? I mean, I would ideally want to conflate the two. We know that the central concern has to be reclaiming of the human essence by and for humans, and to re-establish the unity of humans and nature. To me, that is a very simple central message that has to be the critical concern, the critical objective. Right? Having said that, I mean, how do we go about it? How do we do that? How do we move forward? Yes, there is a lot of discussion, a lot of resistance, a lot of sort of political processes we see all around us. But is it really taking us somewhere? Or are we getting deeper and deeper into the morass? I mean, I think that is the key question which we need to confront. Right? Again, to go back to, I mean, he was very emphatic that the starting point of all this has to be a complete rejection of the model of neoliberal globalization. It has to be the starting point. Right? We have to rethink of maybe a new Bandung, right? That Bandung must, without fail, address all the key challenges which were framed in our conversation today. Challenges of race, gender, caste, ethnicity, class, and so on, right? So, you know, what we started with from Professor Foster's opening remarks and then the way it has flowed. To my mind, I mean, I think some of the most important challenges have been put on the table. And I think to address these, I mean, I think we would be fooling ourselves if we do not hear Sameer's message loud and clear in terms of the beginning of all this has to be a rejection of neoliberal model of globalization. And within that, then start framing what is feasible here and now, right? Now, of course, rejection of neoliberal globalization does not mean, obviously, all of us know as part of this panel, and I guess most in our conversation, most people in our conversation would with us today would agree that socialists were indeed the first globalizers, right? So what terms and conditions of globalization that we're talking about? How do we move in that direction and so on? And to begin with, then, what we put on the table for mobilizing for a process of political regeneration of our vision and resistance and so on. In fact, I'm tempted to rephrase some of the things that Chris Honey said early 1970s. And I'm partly quoting, partly rephrasing what he said. Socialism is not about big concepts or heavy theory. Socialism is about decent shelter for those who are homeless. It is about water for those who have no safe drinking water. It is about healthcare. It is about a life of dignity for everyone, young, old, every color, every race, every tribe, and so on. It is about overcoming the huge divide between the urban and the rural. It is about a decent education for all people. Socialism is about rolling back the tyranny of the markets as long as the economy is dominated, controlled, emasculated by an unelected, privileged few. The case for socialism exists, and the challenge is, how do we undermine that power? How do we undermine that strangulation? Right? I mean, I think in terms of the basic ideas, my sense is we do not lack the vision. What we really lack is appropriate political strategies. And my unease with all of us is that we are not thinking enough about that. Yes, in different parts of the world, things are happening at different paces, right? And we must appreciate that. But the real challenge, as I said, is, are we thinking enough, right? I do think that radical measures are the only realistic alternative, as I interpret the message from Professor Foster. A revolution is needed to overcome our economic and environmental threat in a comprehensive sense. A danger to our collective survival. By now, it's very well documented that if we continue to ignore it, the way things are happening, that imminent maybe disappearance of humanity is not that too far. The aim, as is the theme of this particular panel has to be an eco-socialist society without class domination and without any other kind of domination, as was being pointed out by Professor Wang and all the other preceding speakers, and whether it's patriarchy and many other challenges that we are talking about. And it has to be a life in balance with the rest of nature. Of course, there are huge risks involved in any revolutionary enterprise, but the risk of keeping things as they are is much greater. And hence, the kind of sways segments and sections of the left, like so-called green capitalism. To my mind, it's a complete oxymoron. To my mind, it's a non-starter. Right? It has to be rejected. One has to sort of go beyond these shibboleths, go beyond these mindless, meaningless mirages, and look for what must be done. Long-term species survival is absolutely contingent upon, as we know, a massive reversal of what's been happening in the so-called energy complex. All this requires a sharp break with capitalist priorities, accumulation, profit-making, commodification, growth, etc. A key component of this eco-socialist project has to be a bottom-up approach, as again was mentioned by some of the preceding speakers. The top-down planning and central planning, etc. I mean, they're sort of very suspect and by and large discredited. Right? Yet there is a kind of hankering sometimes for some of those things. Right? So to conclude, what I'm trying to highlight is the real challenge, as I have felt in my engagement with these issues over the last 3 to 4 decades, is what has to be the political project. Do we have sturdy blueprints for that? Apart from, as I said, a lot of noise, a lot of discussion which sort of seems to go under the name of this formation, that formation, and so on. Right? Now, I don't think that is going to take us anywhere. I don't think that is going to take us any further. Right? I think one has to keep in focus that long-run set of core objectives, which is not disconnected with the short-term measures. And how do we then move forward? With that, let me conclude. Thank you for your attention. It's been lovely and wonderful to be part of this panel and learning so much from my preceding speakers. Thank you, Kinchi. Thank you, Sitsui. And thank you all.
Thank you. So thank you very much to our 2 speakers and 4 discussants. I think, well, this is but the whole idea about the forum, when we have 10 full days of discussions and workshops, is that we try to bring together people with from different experiences, but then we try, some of us, we know each other very well, some we don't quite know. And then it was quite a surprise to me when I learned that actually John and Wang Hui never really dialogued directly. But then there will be so much that we have in common. And so I feel that in a way, we start from what we have in common, that many of us draw from Marxist traditions, from Luxembourg, from Gramsci, from Samir, maybe from Che Guevara. So I think that is something that we have in common. But then I feel that for us today, with our eminent speakers from the for this panel, we have each of us been embedded in some of the experiences of, for example, Wang Hui in China, John in the US, Isabel from Cuba, and Boaventura from Portugal, and also, but also especially in the World Social Forum complexities, and well, Praveen from India, and Issa from Tanzania. So in a way, although we say that we are in the global system, we share many of the challenges in common, and yet somehow from our different localities, from our different experiences, we would tend to give focus or to give emphasis to certain aspects of the crisis we are faced with. And so I think this is only, well, one of the meeting points. We have this big network, and we are in different nooks, and now we try to bring some nooks together. We may get more entangled. We may try, so we don't know what the outcome could be, but I feel that in good faith and with the goodwill, we could try to be honest with our own review, especially of our own particular contexts. So I think John was trying to look at the to look at the current moment in US, to look at the significance of the protests of this, what he called the public lynching. And of course, that reminds us of 100 years ago, since, or 100 years or more since the racial discrimination, that this has never gone away. And actually, there are so many things that are so, should be so obvious to everybody. We know about all these racial discriminations. There have been so many incidences. And yet, what is it that has brought suddenly the focus, that crystallized the energies of discontent and resistance in this struggle on the question of the breathing? That we know we cannot breathe, but then now we all feel that we need to breathe together so that we can stop this stage of not being able to breathe. So there are, so at certain conjunctures, we have this interlocking of the conjunctures where certain things happen, and so I feel that maybe I don't know, maybe John could say a bit more, talk a bit more about how you assess the current situation with the particular kind of ruptures that could be bringing about certain objective and particularly subjective changes. And as with Wang Hui, I think the whole idea of talking about the weakest link, which is not only about China or in the 20th century or about the current situation, is also to try to look at where the ruptures could come in, where within those cracks and in those ruptures, there could be emerging new subjectivities, new alliances. And so I think at the same time, when the destructive forces could be so overwhelming, the forces of resistance could also suddenly come on and surprise us all. So where are the energies and where they could be crystallized, and also maybe where they may themselves flow and be channeled. So I think this discussion about the weakest link or the rupture could be one way in which we could try to go into the issues. So I feel that there are a lot of things that we share in common, so maybe we do not need to go into some of those which are basics for us, but of course if we have some other members in our panel who do not, who may not be sharing these, then we have to go to some of those basics about Marxism. And yet because we already share certain things, so we can go into all the complexities. So I feel that we mentioned. I don't know. Maybe I'll just throw one question. John talked about the catastrophe capitalism. If we look at any one of those problems, they could bring the end of humanity. Some people said that with this current pandemic, maybe 40 to 60% of the total population of the world will be infected. And there's no way we can foresee any vaccine because the virus is changing so much. So just, I think 2 days ago, they were saying that from Central Asia, the new virus that's being discovered is 10 times more lethal than the current one that we see. So just with the pandemic alone, I think we still, now we already have 550,000 people dead, which is maybe an underestimate of the actual casualties. So, but then, so that we may still be brought into all these unknown abyss. So just the pandemic alone is enough to maybe eliminate a quarter of the world population, or how much, we do not know. And if we look at the other question that is also the focus of this forum on climate change, we had 38 degrees Celsius in the Arctic a week ago. 38 degrees Celsius. And every year we are breaking the historical records in terms of the climate change. And even when most of the planes were not flying in the last 3 months, the temperature is still going up. So associated with the climate change, there's all the floods, the droughts, the locusts, and all the different viruses. There's the methane that could come out from the icebergs in the Arctic. So just alone on the question of the climate change, humanity could be ending within this century. So, and not to talk about the financial capitalism. So I feel that we are faced with all these catastrophes, but then I also agree that we are not giving up. We are not saying that we will be just simply allowing us to be rolled under by the tsunamis. And yet, are we building Noah's Arks through these communities that are now trying to go for self-sufficiency in production of food, etc.? Are we going for more solidarity especially when we see that now this time from Cuba, from China, from Kerala, these places where there had been a long process of building the social fabric of community solidarity. So a lot of those legacies have been effective in helping us to deal with the pandemic. So the whole idea about this is a time also for reversal of a lot of the privatizations of public health, of questions about food sovereignty, etc. So I feel that maybe that it's difficult to look into the future. If we look in the future, it's difficult to avoid fear and anxiety, but then and phobia. But then, in order not to be thrown, we talked about the stagism just now. But then it could be that we will be thrown into communism, but not the communism that we envisage with the high levels of productivity. It could be the primitive communism where we are simply fighting for bare survival, and which obliges everyone that will still be surviving at that time to be working with each other like thousands of years ago. So it's difficult to say. So with all these random thoughts, then could I invite maybe a few questions or comments from the so-called the floor. And I would like to give more time to our panelists, speakers and discussants to try to thresh out some of the questions. I don't think we can have any answers, but I think if we could be raising more questions that we feel worth pursuing, then we could be following that after the forum. And so now maybe let me see about the questions. So Tani asked the question for all speakers. So please explain how Samir Amin could be helpful in considering how to displace patriarchy. And Tanya also had a question for Wang Hui to please help us understand how your ideas will adjust when you include social reproduction. And how do you think about sexuality and sexual workers in the contemporary informal economy? And what sort of participation will they have? And let me see about the chat. Okay. So I don't know. Patrick Lead, he had a comment. He said, "Our biggest challenge is our political strategy." So paraphrasing Paulo Freire, how do we unify our differences against our common antagonists, our common enemy? Okay, maybe we have this first round first. Maybe we go into the first round. So I don't know whether any of our discussants would like to speak. Maybe Boaventura, would you like to come into this?
Can I speak? Yeah. Thank you very much. Because I have another engagement at 5:30. Well, I think it was very, very interesting. I think we have laid out most of the problems that we are facing, and the problem is of how Dr. colleague Praveen was saying, how we go about this at this point. I think that, in my view, we need to, Issa was asking me about the integration of struggles. Many people are very much concerned with integrating struggles because we have traditions of separation. Trade unions had a kind of a take on the struggles, then the feminist movement had another, the peace movement had another take, the ecological movement had another take on the struggles. And I think we have to unite. How do you unite this? I think that we have to bring in a distinction between important and urgent struggles. All the struggles are important, quite frankly, against these three means of domination. I mean, against patriarchy, against capitalism, and against colonialism, because they go together. And my analysis of their going to be together is a Marxist analysis, is the labor, is questions of free labor, which does not sustain itself with highly developed labor and non-paid labor. That's why they are integrated, basically. It's a labor theory of value, in other words. I think that we have all the tools to integrate theories. We don't have the practices of integration. For instance, today, many of us discuss within the Marxist theory that there are not just one contradiction, but two contradictions in capitalism. Is capital labor and capitalist nature, which is a concept that Marx uses very often, particularly in the early papers. So nature, and of course this is tied to the questions of primitive accumulation, which, as Issa said, is permanent. So class, race, and gender have to be integrated. For instance, at this point in the United States, we can see very clearly the struggle starts as an urgent struggle against racism because of George Floyd. But it is an anti-capitalist struggle. It's an anti-patriarchal struggle. If you look at the data of the pandemic, 62% of the dead in the United States are Black people. It's not a proportion of their share of the population. 60% shows that they are the poor, they are racialized, and they are impoverished populations with lots of vulnerability. So the reality is there ready for us to integrate. That's why I started my comment by working on the idea because I think economy ecology from now on is very clearly, it's there, it's no problem. I start with the question of the transition. How we go from here to there in different parts of the world. Because when I work in Africa, I see some realities in Latin America, other realities in Asia, other realities. Well, the tempos and the dynamics, I think that we are going through a period, probably after this pandemic, we'll go through a short period of deglobalization. People are really afraid of too much globalization because they know that if there is no food sovereignty, if without food sovereignty, we cannot survive. The global production chain is dangerous sometimes if the crisis exists in the system. So we have to relocalize some of our activities again. And this is very interesting. It's new for the theory because we had always this contradiction between localization and globalization. They are not contradictory because globalization happens locally. When the people in Latin America see the rivers being contaminated or the women raped by the enterprises, is globalization happening in their villages. So globalization happens locally. So I think that we have all the conditions to integrate the struggle. Which kind of struggle? And that's my final point. When I look at the issues in the World Social Forum and outside the things that we are concerned with, we see that the struggles are going to have a mix at this point. I think that every age struggles with the weapons that are available. We have still available the ideas of human rights, of democracy, of institutional states, democratic states, you name it. So we have to start with that, with those weapons, but they are not sufficient because the liberal democracy is a shame these days. So we have to have one foot in the institutions and one foot outside the institutions. Is going to be armed struggle again? Well, that's a question that some young people sometimes ask me. Are we going back to armed struggle? Well, you know, it must be extra institutional struggle. I don't think that it will be armed struggle, but because in a period of cyber wars, what does it mean to be armed struggle? What kind of armed struggle are we talking about? So I think it will be on the streets, on the squares of the world, on the public spheres that still exists. And the people are there fighting, struggling, even in those very difficult conditions. So we have to look at the extra institutional forces, the movements of the ground that are coming up with new innovations. And Professor Wang was saying the community and also Foster about the idea of creativity of communities. That's what I've been studying now. How much creativity has been created in the communities, impoverished communities, in slums, to protect the people because the state has abandoned them. State is not there. How do you do about? So this energy from bottom up are the most encouraging element in our current crisis. And then we'll go from there into our political strategies, but never undermine or underwrite all these energies that are coming out from the struggles on the streets. That's what we have to valorize. And I thank you very much for this opportunity. And I have another engagement now. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. So I would like to invite John to give your 15 minutes of response.
I'm impressed by the level of agreement and consensus, the constructiveness of this discussion, so that I learned from all of the talks, and I think that we complemented in each other in many ways. I wanted to, since Kinchi raised the issue of the situation in the United States, I thought I would start there. Dr. SOUSA de Santos said that the United States was a failed state. Well, the United States is a capitalist state, and we say sometimes in the United States that the United States has the best health system in the world. And that's true if from a capitalist standpoint, because it's the most profitable health system in the world. The object isn't to provide health to the population. The object is to use health services as a way of generating the accumulation of capital. If we say that the United States is a failed state because more people are dying in the United States than in other countries, and because more people are unemployed during the pandemic, these were decisions made at the top by a capitalist state, by the capitalist state. And from their standpoint, from the standpoint of the ruling class in the United States, it's a success. It's generally a success because they're putting capital accumulation before people, and that's what we should expect. So we should be very clear when we talk about a failed state, what we mean. The term failed state was introduced by the United States for countries like Cuba that put their people first before capital accumulation. Cuba, according to the United States, is a failed state. So we have to be very clear what we're talking about. In terms of the uprising in the United States, I think we could call it a kind of uprising. It shocked everyone. No one really quite saw it coming. It was a product of the economic crisis and the pandemic, but it's also obviously a product of a long, centuries-long history of racial capitalism in the United States. And people saw a police lynching, and they understood what it was. And not just the Black population, but the white population. There has been the spread in the United States of a critique of racial capitalism. In fact, the latest issue of Monthly Review is on this. The focus in the movement is on the question of racial capitalism, recognizing, though, while we can talk about capitalism in terms of its logic, it's always been racial capitalism. And this sophistication is now everywhere in the movement, along with the critique of settler colonialism. And as you may know, Marx talked about two kinds of colonialism. One was what we call white settler colonialism. He called it colonialism proper. He said the second colonialism was the slaveholder capitalism or plantation system in the United States. We're recovering these critiques that are so fundamental, and through the critique of racial capitalism, we're creating the integration that's necessary. It's this kind of understanding that for the first time brought the white population, a large part of the white working class population, out into the street. It's millions in the United States. And so this represents a change. We don't know how deep it goes, but it's a fundamental change. It was supported by over 2/3 of the population. And the bringing down of the statues, painting George Washington's hands red, bringing them down with ropes that essentially lynching the founding fathers. This is an understanding that's gone very deep now and is changing things. And there's a more coordinated critique of police repression. And so this is a step forward. It's a new sophistication of the population. And it may surprise you because people, if you read the New York Times, Trump's support is the white working class. They never mentioned the white working class until Trump came into office. Trump's support is not the white working class. It isn't the working class at all. It's what the lower middle class, or we could call it the petty bourgeoisie, but it's the lower middle class, about 25% of the population, almost entirely white. But the working class is fundamentally somewhere else. They're fundamentally against what's going on, against the neo-fascism, and so you see this revolt in the streets. That's very, very important. So if you simplify the class situation in the United States and fail to recognize that there's now a conflict between the working class and the lower middle class. The lower middle class, C. Wright Mills called them the rear guard of the system. And monopoly capital, a section of monopoly finance capital, we could call it the neo-fascist section, has enlisted this lower middle class, mobilized them based on a racist and nationalist ideology and a notion of white supremacy to safeguard the US system, which is now a lot more volatile, a lot more shaky for a whole lot of reasons, including the decline of US hegemony than before. And behind this is also the decline of the labor aristocracy in the United States. We didn't like to talk about it, but it existed. There was a kind of labor aristocracy, and that's disappearing as a result of globalization. And you have a situation then where socialism is reviving in these kinds of circumstances. So this tells us things, and one of the things I think that's most important is the growth of solidarity movements. We have to talk about solidarity movements, and this is related to what we were talking about in terms of bringing the struggles of class, race, and gender together. And we have to see this, but also most importantly, we have to struggle against imperialism. Imperialism is the center of the whole thing, or we could say imperialism and colonialism, because we use colonialism to refer to the political and cultural legacy. We tend to use imperialism for the economic, but they're all the same thing, and they penetrate all societies. We have to see that imperialism, particularly imperialism directed against the global South, is the principal problem. The weak link, I think, is still the revolts in the South. It has to be. The question of how China plays into that, whether there's going to be a South-South alliance, a Eurasian South alliance. These are critical questions for us. They relate to the weakest link. These are things that Marxist theory has taught us for a long time. I mean, we can go back to Lenin, we could go back to Che and Fidel. So we have to, I think, as Isabel said, that we have to create a new Marxism out of the old, but that's in the nature of Marxism. It isn't a static, revolutionary doctrine. If it were, it would not be revolutionary. It would not be worth anything at all. We have to talk, as was said, we have to recognize that there's a new epistemology of the South is one way of talking about it, but I like to talk about it in terms of vernacular revolutionary traditions. Every country in the world, as they engage in class struggle, they engage in revolution, they create their own vernacular revolutionary traditions, whether it's Venezuela or China, Cuba, and we could go down the list, but we have to learn from them all. They all have lessons to teach us, and this is crucial. I don't like the term primitive accumulation, which is related to imperialism, obviously, and Marx didn't write about ecology only in terms of primitive accumulation. He wrote about ecology in all of his work, and this has been rediscovered. My own Marxist Ecology was about this, but it's the most penetrating ecological critique we have, because it's a critique of a system of production far removed from what green analysis teaches us. And it didn't stop with Marx either. I've just come out with my book Return of Nature, which deals with the century, basically the century after Marx's death, and the development of ecology and socialism together. Socialists basically created ecology. Not all socialists, and the socialist movement was often distant from it. but where ecology came from, ecological thought came from socialist thinkers, and primarily Marxist thinkers, and this has been downplayed. But anyway, when we talk about primitive accumulation, I don't like the term because when Marx called it so-called primitive accumulation, he didn't like the term. It was not accumulation, it was expropriation. Accumulation and expropriation aren't the same thing. And it wasn't just primitive or original, it was basic to setting the boundaries for capitalism all through its existence. It's basically a way of understanding imperialism. So neither primitive or accumulation makes much sense in Marxian terms. And actually, if you read the section on so-called primitive accumulation, Marx mainly talks about expropriation. And what is expropriation in his terms? It's a situation where there is no equal exchange. It's a system of expropriation, robbery, and this actually underlies capitalism much more fundamentally than we often recognize. So that women's labor is expropriated, or women's labor, domestic labor in the home, subsistence labor is expropriated, the environment is expropriated by capitalism as a free gift for capital. We have to integrate these things into our theory of exploitation, our theory of capitalist accumulation, understand how exploitation and expropriation are connected to each other, just like capitalism and imperialism are connected to each other. And the reason we have to make these connections is so that we can integrate our struggles. We have to understand that the struggle of indigenous people and the struggle of African Americans and the struggle of, well, we could look at the whole history of the Pan-African movement. We have to understand that these issues of race and colonialism aren't separate. In the United States, people are told that racism is just something that people have in their heads. They have no idea until recently. It's dawning on the population that racism was a product of colonialism and imperialism, and that is connected to capitalism. Once these connections are made, our movements will mature. We'll have more integrated struggles, and I think that we see there are revolutions that we can learn from. I think we can learn from the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela with the notion of the communal state. I think we can learn from Cuba. I think we can still learn from the Chinese Revolution, which I don't think is even over yet. I think maybe it's still continuing. And so we have to think these ways. It has to be integrated. I think this is what Samir talked about. Samir was very clear that the weakest link of capitalism was the revolutions in the global south, and that's what we've always believed in Monthly Review. So in our view, the South-South Forum is very important, and my role, let's say, as somebody from the United States, I would think is secondary, because I think that the organization of the struggle is going to come primarily from the South, and certainly those in the United States have a special role to play because it's Fortress America and the center of a world empire, and struggles here matter. But the real decisions, the real movement is going to come from the South. So as opposed to the Progressive International or the Socialist International, all of that, I think that we have to build a new international of workers and peoples that starts from the South. And because imperialism is still, if the struggle against imperialism, not the struggle against neoliberalism as such, is the primary struggle if we're going to get to socialism. Anyway, that's my reaction to all the things people say, but I think I'm in some ways just echoing all of you.
John, thank you so much. Actually, we would like to later on maybe have some lectures or more discussion from you to talk about the question of ecology, because I think that is so important. Now, I would like to invite Wang Hui to talk for 15 minutes. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I really learned a lot from our colleagues, and those questions are important. I'm not sure whether or not I can answer properly. The first of all, I want to a little bit elaborate why I raised the issue of the old term, the weakest link, because as Kingji said that we try to find the ruptures in current system. Before, in the 20th century, we mainly considered in the geographical views to think about where is a marginal area as a weakest link. But on the other hand, in the global systems, in a contemporary capitalism, we also can think about the links like the pandemic really give the chance to see how dangerous, how the so many ruptures in the whole systems. Before these were in China, we had long debates about the orientation of the medical system reform, and the new liberal agenda of the marketization was more and more dominant. A lot of the battles and a lot of the huge debates on that. But these kind of the pandemic crisis give the chance to see the necessity for have the whole coverage of the medical system for the whole population. And in the whole the crisis, like Wuhan, the crisis, the most of the volunteers and the doctors sent to there came from the state-owned the hospitals, were not from the market the sectors. So these were in these the area, whether or not we have a socialist orientation for the medical reform is very important. And these related to the other issues together, the ecological issues and so on and so forth. So these are the why we need to think about these. And also John, you mentioned that the monthly review of the older topic, maybe sometimes the weakest link is not necessarily in the south, but also in the north. And you see that the performance of in the pandemic crisis, that a lot of the countries in the south, they do better than the south, than the north. So in that sense, the capitalist system shows a different ruptures. We can see we need to find where it is. So in that case, we can organize our social struggle. And when we think about the solidarity, the struggles, we also need to grasp the singularity of the current situation. I mean, these are the first why we need to. That's why Lenin's arguments for that, we always need to find the current, contemporary, the challenge in a given context. So that in that sense, so it's the old term, but we need to find a new place we can apply for. And the same that as Praveen also said that like a diversity and so on and so forth. All these terms used by different peoples and for different uses. Sometimes used for like identity politics, nationalism, and so on and so forth. And I think that the diversity, it's because of the translation issue again that we related to. In the morning, Professor Miniolu mentioned that the English the terms, but in other terms, maybe we can use the language to describe the situation. It's not simply the diversity. First of all, it's the equality of the diversity. It's more or less go beyond the anthropocentric view of nature and the human being. So these are ecological diversity itself can be integrated into the rethinking about the equality, because the conservation of the nature or the conservation of the diversity, ecological diversity, was also related to the relationship between our generation and the future generations. The future generation, if we use up all these natural resources and not respect these kind of the ecological diversity, eventually that the future generation will living in a terrible situation. So before that, we all think about the reality, the equality issue was individual and individual. That's a Bourgeois idea. Or in current generation, we are living in the same world. But what about the future generation? What about these kind of the issue? So in that sense, we need to, all these kind of the thinking need to be, I think that the socialist legacy and the new kind of the socialist orientation is important for the rethink these issues of the equality. The last I want to the answer, I think that I saw that Tani's the question about the informal economy, maybe together with the Kinji told me that also together with the patriarchy issue, but I focus on the informal economy issues maybe here, and you know that the informal employment in China was high, much high than the formal employments now, partly because a lot of the huge population, the migrant laborers from the countrysides towards the cities and then informally employed in different regions. And in certain kind of the industry was very high, like the construction industry. There's a huge numbers of the industrial laborers without the labor contract at all. So in that sense, it's difficult for them to find legal protection in that sense. Of course, a lot of the social struggles for that, a lot of the social struggles. Okay, I see. That maybe your a lot of the social struggles on these kind of the issues were in different levels. If you want to have some the cases, I can give you some issues, a lot of the documents for that. And at the same time, I would like to say something about the poverty issues, because my own experience for that, 30 years ago, I spent some time in the Qingling, in the mountain areas. That was the poorest area in China. The two phases of that. The one is improvement of the transportation. At that time, when I was it's not like Professor Barlow's the question about prostitution case, but it's also related to the woman's issue, because at that time when I was there in the mountain area, because lack of the transportation, a lot of the villages, kids, more than 0.5% of the population in the villages were idiots because of consanguineous marriage, because completely no transportation, and 50–60% of the people were really like the idiots. So that's the situation. But these partly because of the transportation, the condition changed. These kind of the situation transformed. But on the other hand, because of the so-called informal workers, a lot of the young generation move out of that. And in the current crisis, that's created the new difficulties. I guess I have no time to answer all these the questions. I stop here.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much to all our panelists. I must stop here because it's already